The 1960s gave KTIB listeners a native-born broadcaster in Danny Borne, and while the pronunciation of his name is now Borne, his memories of the local news and sports scene remains very pronounced. Dan Borne, how are you today?
I'm just doing great, and I really am honored that you would call and invite me to be part of this celebration. Of course, back when I was in Thibodeau, I went by the name Borne, and most people would remember me as Danny Borne. I grew up with that name, and only when I left Thibodeau, after I graduated from Nichols and after I had worked 4 years at KTIB, I put an accent on my E, and I'm the only person that I know that pronounces it wrong. But it kind of stuck with me after television, and so we've kept it.
Well, very much so. Now, before we go any further, I had a chance in an earlier episode in the series to talk to your cousin Ed.
Yes, indeed.
And he had also mentioned it. Now, this was his version of the story. He had said that another reason why that you changed the accent or the pronunciation on your name was that there was some concern that when people would hear your name pronounced Borne, that they might get you confused with the name Barnes.
Well, that's possible, but the real reason was that I had not even heard this name pronounced this way for most of my adolescent life. And I went to New Orleans to a doctor one day, and the nurse came out and said, Dan Borne. And she said it 3 or 4 times, and it was only after about the 4th time that I realized that she was mispronouncing my name, that it was really Borne, but she pronounced it Borne. So I said, I'm going to file that somewhere and I may use it one day. So when I went on to Channel 9, it was either going to be Danny Borne or Daniel Borne, which is so close to Daniel Boone. I just decided, let's just try Borne and see what happened. That's what stuck.
All right. Well, let's go back to your days in Thibodeau. I assume, did you attend Nichols State?
I did. I went to Nichols. I literally grew up on the corner of Menard and Audubon Streets. We moved there in 1952. And it was nothing but open land back then. And right across the street was one building. That was Nichols Junior College. And it was literally the old administration building without the 2 wings that are on it now. And one shack, that there was an ROTC shack right behind the administration. They watched that school grow as I grew up. And when I got out of Thibodeau High School in 1964, it was just, it was a no-brainer. I was going to go to Nichols because I had fallen in love with that school from 1st to 2nd grade on.
Mm-hmm. Was communications your major?
No, actually, I majored in history. I was a history major and a government and English minor. And I always enjoyed writing because in high school I had for 2 years written the articles for the Daily Comet on the Thibodeau High School football team. So I was a statistician for the football team because I was not good enough to play. But Tim Lindsay, who teaches at Nichols and has taught there for many years, I think Tim is probably still there. Tim broke me in as a statistician for the Thibodeau High football team. And as a result of that, I started writing the articles. So I had a love for sports and a great love for writing. And I had a journalism course at Nichols with Dr. Al Delahaye. And he really helped me learn how to write. And so that was sort of my interest, although the journalism thing was secondary in terms of history, English, and government. It was always something that I loved to do, and it served me well later in life.
So how do you go from a history major at Nichols to working at KTIB?
Well, my brother Lanny Borne, who still lives in Chupick along with Beverly, his wife and children, he worked at the station. He worked at KTIB back in the late 50s and early 60s, and Lanny kind of introduced me to radio work, and I met Leroy Martin, and Leroy invited me down to open his fan mail when I was still in high school. And I would go on a Saturday and pick up Leroy's mail and open it up and set it up so that some of the records that he played, and we actually played records back then, some of the records that he played were in answer to the letters that he had got in terms of his fan mail. And so I sort of, started hanging around that station through high school. When I went to Nichols, I was in a club called the Circle K Club. It was sort of a creation of the Kiwanis Club at Thibodeau. And Charles Cherry, who was from Thibodeau and eventually got a degree in education and has taught for many, many years, Charles was an upperclassman, and he invited me to join the Circle K Club. And I would always enjoy extracurricular activities. I've been president of the Thibodeau High School student body, and as a freshman, it was something to get involved in. And one of the things that we did was every Saturday morning we went down to KTIB, and we did a 30-minute program. Circle K did. It's sort of a community service. And what we do is we take articles from the Nichols worth and we summarize them. And that's when I started, talking into a microphone when I was a freshman in college. And later that year, Coach Raina Didier decided that he wanted to put on radio Nichols baseball games. And so in January and February of 1965, Coach Didier convinced Ray Sadie that this was something that would sell, and indeed it did sell. And Nichols baseball was on the air on KTIB, and it's the only station in the country at the time, and probably the first station, commercial station, to actually broadcast baseball, college baseball. Well, as it was, I was very interested in sports, and Jim Swiler, who I know you've interviewed and was a great part of KTIB history, Jim invited me to do the color for the Nichols baseball team, and so my schedule was I could do it, and I went to a couple of games with Jim and started doing the color, and frankly, I wouldn't shut up, and Jim decided I think he could make more money selling, and he could just let me talk, and so Jim got off the broadcast, and for 4 years I did Nichols baseball. Did all the games for 4 years, the road games and everything else, and back in those days, we had no color commentary. You kind of got on and you did the game. I loved it. It was just wonderful, and that eventually evolved into a great interest in broadcasting. And when I left Nichols in 1968 to come to graduate school here at Nichols, here at LSU in history, I applied for a job at Channel 9 and Channel 2. Sent them an audio tape. And it was pure luck. I mean, it was absolutely pure coincidence that at Channel 9, 2 people were leaving right when my audition tape hit the news director's desk, and he was pretty frantic. He invited me up, and he took a look and said, "Good, you're on. You start tomorrow." And this is a true story. And so on my 22nd birthday, I started doing sports at 10 o'clock for Channel 9 here at Baton Rouge, and that eventually went into an anchor job for news and sports as well. So that's kind of how you get from Thibodeau High School to Channel 9 in 4 short years. It takes a lot of luck and a lot of opportunity that's kind of thrown in your path.
Now, Jim Swiler mentioned a story about when you covered college baseball, and you want to tell the listeners about it as well. He had mentioned one time he thinks Nichols State had to play baseball at NLU, and there was a bit of a problem because of where the phone line and the electrical lines were.
Well, there was always a problem. Back in those days, we didn't have a Marty that we could take on, a Marty being a microwave-type operation that we could take on road trips. And, I've literally had to do baseball games. What we did them back then, the phone company would run what we call a loop, a wire, and you would have to bring an extension cord for electricity, and you'd have to bring enough cord to make sure that you had access to that telephone wire, and you'd plug that into your unit. I mean, I've literally done baseball games sitting in the front seat of the Nichols bus. I did baseball games sitting on the top row of the bleachers at left field, the bottom row of the bleachers along the first baseline. It's kind of wherever that telephone guy wanted to install that loop, and it was hardly ever easy. Let me put it that way. But part of the joy of doing it was that I just loved the game. I loved baseball, and irrespective of the inconvenience, it was always fun to travel with the team.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to talk about some of the people I believe you worked with at KTIB, and quite a few good people have worked there over the decades. And one person I have to mention who really established herself for a long time on dialogue, Marie Bashron.
Well, what can you say? She was both a mother and a guardian and a role model for all of us. And, she wasn't that much older than we were, but she was there and established, and she was the continuity director. She handled all of the logs, and, you know, we're getting into some technical talky, but it's important to know when certain spots are supposed to run and how many times they're supposed to run and what time they're supposed to run. Marie handled all of that. Marie, she would take the young people and she would give them elocution classes. I mean, you know, I came in saying that we're going to do it Wednesday afternoon. She says, Danny, it's not Wednesday, it's Wednesday. I mean, Wednesday is the word, Wednesday is not a word. Well, Marie was just, she took everyone under her wing. She loved everybody. Everybody loved her. And I got to tell you, there's very, very few people in this world that you come into contact with that you have never, ever heard anything detrimental about. Never a cross word from her, and never a cross word about her from anyone. She is just a great lady. She also could handle Ray Sadie real well. You know, because Ray would come in and he'd say this and he'd say that and he'd say this, and I'd say, you know, well, Marie said we ought to do it this way, and Ray would say, well, do it the way Marie said. Yeah, she's a great lady.
Now, of course, Mr. Sadie, the one thing I usually get from most of the people I interview when I mention his name is the incredible dynamics he seemed to bring to radio. Would you say that's a fair description?
He is the greatest salesman I have ever known. Ray Sadie, you know, you talk about selling Eskimos ice boxes. Man, he could sell them. He could sell them anything. Ray is a quintessential salesman, and he really knew how to run a station. He could sell. He had a great gift of gab. He was a terrific on-air guy when he came to spots. Great production guy. Just absolutely. I marveled as I watched work. His selling was outstanding. And his judgment was just terrific. And you know, anytime there was an emergency, anytime there was a problem, I mean, Ray would get that little recorder and little reel-to-reel recorder and run out and do an interview. I mean, if news needed to be covered, he covered it. He did everything. And you know, I'm sure he's retired now, having you know gone established KHOM and then buying KTIB, and I guess selling them both now. He has a richly earned retirement, but I'm sure he's not bored. I'm sure he's still active in little theater work in Homeland and Terrebonne. I sure hope he is.
Oh, very much so. Now, let's go back to a gentleman you mentioned earlier, who I think by far on the air was probably one of the most energetic personalities the station ever had, and Leroy Martin.
Well, Leroy Martin was playing country music on commercial radio long before most people were. I mean, I can recall when that was the only country and western music anywhere. And now, look at all the stations we have playing it. You know, Leroy not only played country music, he played the records, Leroy also wrote a lot of country music. Leroy wrote many of the great songs that Ben Bruce recorded. Ben Bruce being an institution down in Lafourche Parish and in the country and western world. Leroy, it's sort of trite to say people on the cutting edge because it's overused now, but let me tell you, Leroy recognized the value and the potential of that kind of music early on. And what's good about Leroy, you could sing it in English and you could sing it in French. You could sing both ways. And he had gigs every Saturday night because I know when I used to help him with opening his mail, the last hour of that slot generally was relegated to other types of music other than country and western. And Leroy would often let me handle that while he prepared for his gig. And you know, he would travel long distances after he got off at KTIB on Saturday nights and go out and play music and really help establish country music throughout the South. He is an institution, and KTIB was his place. I mean, he had that show on for years and years and years. He taught me so much about how to handle people, how to handle folks who want to hear certain types of music. Yeah, and of course, you know, over the years, he went into politics and was very successful in politics. And I saw him about 2 months ago. He was up here in Baton Rouge for a meeting of one of the retirement systems, and I think he serves on the board. He still looks terrific, and I bet he's still singing.
Mm-hmm. Now, at the time you were at KTIB, was the chief engineer Lee Martin?
Well, I tell you, we had two engineers. Lee Martin was an engineer who was on call at all times for us. The chief engineer was Sam Eaton. Sam was the engineer who stayed around the station full-time. And when we had other problems that Sam was off or could not be reached, we would call Lee Martin. But yes, they both did engineering work for KTIB.
Okay. Now, I want to bring up a question Jim Swiler told me to ask you. He said there was one thing I needed to ask because he wanted your reaction and the explanation for our listeners, and that is, in your life, what does the name Julius T. Boudreaux mean?
Junius T. Boudreaux.
Okay, thank you.
Well, to my mind, Junius T. Boudreaux is sort of representative of all of us down in Thibodaux and in Lafourche Parish. You know, we're sort of almost always, what would Junius T. Boudreaux think of this? He was sort of the poster child in terms of name for all of us who grew up on the block. And I don't know if there ever was a Junius T. Boudreaux in real life, but it was, as I recall, it was sort of the metaphorical Cajun, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And we always used to tell, you know, jokes about Junius T. Boudreaux. Of course, Junius T. Boudreaux as a person didn't exist, but kind of like, yes, Virginia, there is a Junius T. Boudreaux. He's kind of hard to find, but he's out there somewhere. He's sort of a stereotypical Cajun who grew up like all the rest of us grew up down in Thibodaux.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm sure in the years you're at KTIB, a lot of important news stories took place, but I will bet one of the top news stories that you had to be a part of must have been Hurricane Betsy.
Well, there's no question about that. You know, Betsy came through in 1965, and it destroyed a lot of South Louisiana. Thibodaux was out of power for quite some time. We had an emergency generator on the air at KTIB, of course, and I did a lot of air work during that period, both immediately following the hurricane and for several days following the hurricane. It was one of those defining moments, you know, in an area's history because it was a devastating storm. It created a lot of news stories. We had national interest. We had network television crews coming down to Thibodaux and to Lafourche to do stories. And of course, Raymond, Sadie was right on top of it. I mean, he was interviewing all of the dignitaries and all of the celebrities and all of the big people. But he also, you know, interviewed the local folks who were really responsible for the emergency response and kind of whipping the area back into shape after a very difficult storm.
Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the roughest probably will ever know. And I want you to tell people a little story that you mentioned on Jim Inkster's show not too long ago. Tell everybody the time you got a call from Mr. Sadie when you played a Ray Charles song.
I love listening to 640 on my car radio. Of course, back then it was 630. Our frequency was 630, but 640 comes into Baton Rouge real well. So I listen to it from work a lot. And, you know, you're playing oldies. And I love oldies, and, of course, that's the music I grew up with. Our format back in the 60s was not rock, but was so we used to call it middle road, M-O-R. And what that meant was it was Andy Williams, it was sort of Johnny Mathis, John Gary, Anita Bryant, Ray Conniff in the singers, the Andre Castellanos Orchestra, those types of things. Well, one day during drive time, which was 5 to 6 on KTIB back then, I let drive time off, and to me, drive time was you kind of play a little peppier music and keep people awake while they're driving home. So I played a Ray Charles song. I think it was "I Can't Stop Loving You," and Sadie Raymond was listening on his radio. He listened to the radio everywhere he went. I mean, you know, he almost. If they had jam boxes back then, he'd have had one on his ear all the time. He was always monitoring what was going on at KTIB. He was in his car, and he stopped at probably a 7-Eleven or whatever we had back then, Shop and Save. I had one in the whole town. Called me on the payphone and said, "Borne, if you ever play that kind of music again, I'll kill you. Don't ever play Ray Charles." Now, I hear Ray Charles all the time on KTIB. So I'm saying to myself, I was way ahead of the curve. You know, way ahead of public opinion by playing Ray Charles in 1964.
I was just saying, of all the things to get in trouble for.
Yeah, right. Or there were other things we could have gotten in trouble for, but maybe he wasn't listening back then.
Very much. Now, before I move on, I definitely want to ask you about the gentleman who owned the station at the time, Mr. Block, Mr. Jackson, and then Mr. Larson. What kind of owners were they to work for?
They were wonderful people. I knew all three of them. Mr. Ferd Block was a father to four of my very, very best friends. All four of his children were friends of our family. June, Claire, Harold, and Gerald being exactly my age. I grew up with all those people. So I had known Mr. Block long before I went to work at KTIB. Mr. Jackson lived in Thibodeau as well, Mr. Ed Jackson. And Mr. Sam Larson lived, I think he lived in New Orleans. But we would see those owners quite a bit. They'd come by, and not all three at one time. They'd walk through the station and tell everybody hello. They're wonderful people. I think the key thing in their lives was that they were local. Both Mr. Jackson and Mr. Block were local, and anything that went wrong at that station, they would hear about right away. And so they were really, really concerned about making sure that KTIB did everything right, that we maintained an effective community service as a radio station. And so they were great people, and I owe them a lot because they owned the station that kind of gave me my start professionally. And they were delightful to be around, and they were excellent men to work with and for.
Before we move on, there's another Mr. Sadie story I'd like for you to have the opportunity to confirm or deny that he mentioned a few months ago. When I had mentioned your name in the sit-down interview we did with him in the summer, he had mentioned that he knew that you were destined for television, because one day he said he was walking in the building, and he noticed while you were reading the news on the air that on the piece of glass that was part of the control room, he noticed there was a square piece of tape, 4 pieces of freezer tape stuck to the window, and that you were looking through those 4 pieces of tape, and that when you finished reading the news and got off the air, he had asked you about the tape, and he had said that your reply to that was that you were imagining that was the teleprompter, so that one day when you got into television, you'd be ready to go.
Man, he tells some stories on me. He's going to get me in trouble. I didn't practice all that much, but I always kind of enjoyed fantasizing about being on television because it was. I love the media. I mean, I'm still a media hog, and I still do some of those gigs when I can. But yeah, I'm not in a good position to refute anything that my former boss says about me. He was a hands-on boss, and he'd walk into the studio in the middle of the newscast just to kind of check things out. So if I had that tape up there and I was staring into it like a teleprompter, I'd plead guilty.
Okay. Now, from there, you move on to Channel 9 in Baton Rouge, and you did that for a little while. And I'll bet you when you were covering sports, you must have felt pretty fortunate to be there at the time when a pretty good basketball player at LSU named Pete Maravich was around.
I tell you, it couldn't have been more fortuitous. I came to Baton Rouge, and I'd heard about this kid. And, of course, as a freshman, Pete Maravich played at LSU, and back in those days, freshmen didn't play varsity ball. And Maravich would literally, pack out not the Maravich Assembly Center, it's the John M. Parker Coliseum. It seated about 8,000 people. And for freshman games, it would be full. And then after the freshman game, everybody would leave, and you'd have maybe 300 people for the varsity until he became a varsity player his sophomore year. And he played 3 years and set, the all-time scoring record in terms of points per game as well as in total points in a career for major college basketball. And I really had the good fortune of knowing him and his father and covering him 2 years, especially the year that he set the all-time scoring record, which I covered for CBS Radio. It was really something that I don't think it'll ever be duplicated in basketball. He averaged over 44 points a game, William. That's a game over a 3-year career. That's bizarre. That's unheard of. And if we had a three-point line back then, I mean, he probably averaged 60 points a game because so many of his shots were just rainbows from way, 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 way back. And so, yeah, that was exciting. I covered LSU basketball and football, and also covered Southern. Southern had an athlete named Willie Davenport, great football player, but also a gold medalist in the 68 Olympics in track and field, one of the greatest hurdlers ever to run. Came back to Southern and played 2 years of college football after he had won a gold medal in the Olympics. It was a great, great time for sports in Baton Rouge.
Well, I take it, if I may ask, how come your stint at Channel 9 was so short?
Well, I spent 2 years at Channel 9, and I had the opportunity to come back to Nichols and work. And I decided, I really loved Thibodeau and I loved Nichols. And Dr. Galliano called. He had a job that was Director of Publications and Public Information for Nichols, and he'd like me, to consider coming back to Thibodeau. My wife was a teacher, and she loved Thibodeau, so we both went back to Thibodeau in 1970. And I taught 2 classes at Nichols in news writing and reporting, and along with Leslie Wharton Marcella. Leslie handled all of the yearbook and Nicholsworth stuff, and I sort of worked on the other stuff. And I spent about 9 months there, but in March or so, following the July that I came back to Thibodeau, I got the opportunity to go to Washington to work for a United States Senator, and I went to talk with President Galliano about it. And the president said, "Look, go to Washington. You can help us more there. You can help us here. So go." So I went. So my wife and I picked up and took off to Washington and spent several years up there.
Mm-hmm. And when did you come back to Louisiana?
Well, I worked for Senator Ellender in Washington for a couple of years until his death in mid part of 1972. And after he died, I went to work for Senator Russell Long for several years. And my wife and I returned to Baton Rouge in 1975, middle part of 75. Came back to work for Governor Edwards, who was at the time a couple of years into his first term. And I worked for Governor Edwards for 2.5 years as Executive Secretary here in Baton Rouge.
Wow. And so it sounds like just at that point alone, you've had a pretty exciting professional career.
I was really blessed. I mean, I had people who early in life helped me a lot. I had men and women who were very open to helping a young person, and I am eternally indebted to them. Ray Sadie and Marie Bashron, 2 of them.
Mm-hmm.
Can't tell you how influential they were in my life.
Mm-hmm. And also, I believe now you're part of the Louisiana Chemical Association?
Yeah, I worked for government, state government till around 78. And for 10 years after that, I worked for the Kaiser Aluminum Chemical Corporation, one of the big companies that we had 3 big plants here in Louisiana at the time. Did that for 10 years, and in 1988, I changed jobs and went to work for the Louisiana Chemical Association. Still work for them. They represent about 70 chemical manufacturers in Louisiana. Guys and companies that make the building blocks for everything we use as consumers, including the chemicals that go into DVDs, into digital cameras, into computers, into television and radio transmitters, and all those types of things.
Wow. Now, before we go, I definitely want you to tell listeners this great story you mentioned as well on Jim Inkster's show about how you got the LSU football public address job after the great Sid Crocker retired.
Well, I tell you what, I worked with Sid. Sid worked at Channel 9 at the same time I did. And while I was covering LSU sports, Sid was doing LSU football. He was the PA guy for LSU football. And in 1968, in one of the LSU games, I went up to see him in the press box, and he said, "Come over here, I want to show you where I work." And he brought me to his booth, and kiddingly, he said, "Take a look at this, because you may be doing this one day." And we kind of laughed about that. But Sid retired in 1985 after 30 years. I was working for Kaiser at the time, and I didn't have any real connections to LSU. I wrote him a letter, and I said, I used to do this kind of like in Thibodeau on radio, and I did 2 years at Channel 9 many years ago, but I would like to be considered for this job. And I didn't hear from him. And I just let it go, saying, well, that's all done. I mean, somebody's got that job. About 3 weeks before the 86 season, I got a call, and I went over and visited with them, and they said, do you still want to do this? And I said, yes, I'd love to do it. And they said, well, you can. And I said, well, thank you very much. Why? And they said, because no one else asked. And that's a true story. You know, apparently no one else had even asked to be considered. And so it's kind of like a story I tell the young people I teach now. I teach at LSU, one course a semester over there as an adjunct. And I tell them, you know, you have to ask. If you don't ask, you're guaranteed you won't find out. Apparently, some folks who might have been interested figured that it was automatically filled from the inside, or when Sid retired, they had someone who, you know, would automatically slip in. But that was not the case at all. And again, it's just a you know, a very lucky situation that I'm glad I didn't have to try out, because if I had to try out, I probably would have lost the job. But 2 years later, the basketball job came open, so I've been doing football since '86 and basketball since '88. It's a lot more fun when we win, believe me, William.
Oh, very much so, and it's a lot better when you don't have to worry about all that bad weather, huh?
Man, listen, we had 2 games this year. One of them interrupted by lightning. That's the first time that's ever happened. And the other one was delayed by lightning. And we had one delayed back in the 80s for about 20 minutes because of lightning. Delayed, by that I mean the kickoff was delayed.
Mm-hmm.
We never had one interrupted because of lightning. But that happened this year. And I'll tell you what, I've never seen offensive linemen move so fast in my life. When that lightning bolt struck, we had our whole offensive line outrun our wide receivers to the locker room. It was the most incredible thing. I guess that's why we've won so many games this season. We've got a really good team that can move fast, you know.
Especially all of a sudden.
Exactly.
Well, listen, Dan Borne, we really appreciate your time as being part of our series. And before we go, is there anything you'd like to say to all our listeners?
Well, it was. I just want to say there's no place in the world I love more than Thibodeau. It's my home. And some of the best times of my life were spent spinning records at KTIB and doing Nichols baseball. And I will always be indebted to the people there who helped me along as a young person. And it's on shoulders that I've managed to climb. And I just want to tell them thank you. I love them all. And I visit when I can. I don't visit as often as I should, but I think about them all the time.
Dan Borne, another shining example of KTIB's